Hi, I'm Professor Rich and this is TYT History. Today I want to talk in defense of Prohibition. Yeah, you heard me right. I'm going to defend Prohibition. And I calm down. That doesn't mean that I don't think you should drink or that I really give a damn whether you drink or not. It certainly doesn't mean that I think it should be brought back. But I do want to try to make Prohibition make more sense. One of the, I think the most valuable things we can learn if we want to understand history better is this simple lesson. If you look back at the past and something looks stupid that was widely accepted, it's probably because you don't understand the circumstances of the time. And I think Prohibition is a great example of that. So let me explain why Prohibition wasn't as bad as you think it was. I think today when we think about Prohibition, we tend to think of it as some sort of moral or religious crusade. And while those elements were certainly there, I don't think we quite understand those forces themselves and the other forces around this. The idea for Prohibition has actually been around a long time. The great revolutionary era physician, Benjamin Rush, had pushed for it because he thought it was a major health crisis in the country. By the way, some people believe we drank as much as 3 times as much liquor back then as we do today, so it was a much bigger problem. In 1851, the state of Maine famously banned spirits, specifically liquor. Another thing we don't really understand about Prohibition is a lot of the time people would say, well, beer and hard cider are okay. We just want to get rid of liquor. We don't mind if you get drunk on those things, but liquor causes people to get too drunk, and that's the problem. And I think that nuance is lost. Prohibition was actually fairly popular leading up to the Civil War, although the idea of outlawing alcohol waned significantly during the Civil War. I guess we all needed a drink then. But it got exacerbated again by urbanization as people flooded into the cities. And this made alcoholism generally and the overconsumption of alcohol a problem as bars and saloons began popping up everywhere, and a lot of forces here, but basically moving from a farm world where it could still be a pretty significant problem to a world of industrial workers. It really made a lot of the problems of alcoholism worse. The thing that the biggest point I want to make today is that today when we talk about something like banning drugs, a lot of people like to say, well, it's a victimless crime. If I want to go do drugs all the time, what business is that of yours? Even if it wrecks my life, stay out of my business. But alcoholism at the time was not a victimless crime. And that's what I think we're missing. The overwhelming majority of people who were drinking too much and had these problems were men. And this was a time where it was very difficult to get a divorce. Women had very, very few rights to do things like testify in court, bring charges against someone, own property. It was very difficult to be a woman living on your own. This is not Sex in the City. You basically need a man in your life to take care and provide for you. That man could beat you and rape you if you were his wife, and that was all perfectly legal. He could also beat the children and treat them essentially with a few restrictions, almost however he wanted to. His wife and children were essentially his property, and it was almost impossible to escape them. And so if a man developed a drinking problem, if he fell in with demon drink, there were victims. There were very real victims, his wife and his children. And it's not like today where they could go and there are programs, both public and private, to help them and get them on their feet, and a woman can seriously go out, have a career, and make a decent living. If your husband fell into this, or your dad, in some sense your life was effectively a shambles if and when he ever got better. And that's of course where the impetus comes from. It comes from women. Groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, founded in 1869, energetically led by Frances Willard, one of the greatest lobbyists in American history. Of course, what she's lobbying for is the banning of alcohol. You might be familiar with Carrie Nation, who goes around Kansas with a hatchet, smashing up saloons. Barkeepers tended to put signs up in their bar that would say, "All nations welcome except Carrie," which is kind of funny. She would go on speaking tours and hand out miniature hatchets. But she was standing up for women. And this was effectively a women's rights movement. And what they were saying, more than they were saying, we have a problem with you having fun, or we have a problem with the immorality of alcohol. What they're saying is alcohol is destroying the women's and our children's lives. And I think that too often we don't think about it in those terms. A couple of other factors that go into this is, like I said before, many people when they talked about banning alcohol meant banning spirits, banning liquor, not so much beer. And in some sense this was a cute little game that the breweries played with the distilleries. So the breweries would go around and try to get all the distilleries shut down and make spirits or liquor illegal, and then everybody would drink beer, in much the same way that the beer companies today spend enormous amounts of money trying to stop or trying to keep marijuana illegal. Whereas, ironically, when Prohibition finally does come around, the breweries get shut down too. But that was never the plan, at least among those folks. There's an element of racism here, or maybe ethnicism here, as drinking was stereotypically associated with particularly the Germans and the Irish, who in many parts of the country were hated in some places as much or possibly even more than African Americans were. Now, the truth is that Americans who had been here for generations drank probably about as much as these ethnic groups. Just like today, where drug usage is higher among whites than it is minority groups, but the stereotype is it's all the minorities doing all the drugs. It was very similar back then. The guy whose family had been here since the Mayflower is getting just as drunk, if not drunker, than the immigrant. But when people talk about alcohol, they're always pointing the finger at the immigrant. And so you have this element of racism, even though they're all white people, so that's a weird word to use. There is a religious dimension. There are certainly people who find God and decide that excessive drink is a problem, and they go after that. And then there's one more issue here that's probably the least talked about, which is taxation. By the time we get to the turn of the century, progressives want a more progressive taxation system. The single largest source of government revenue was a tax on alcohol. Did you know that? That's pretty amazing, isn't it? The income tax of the pre-income tax era was an alcohol tax. Yeah. You think all the way back to Alexander Hamilton's whiskey tax that caused the Whiskey Rebellion. That became a major source of revenue for the country. But this was a regressive tax, because who's paying that? As a percentage of your income, poor people are paying much more than wealthy people. Now, progressives who wanted a progressive income tax, they wanted the burden to fall heavier on the wealthy than the poor, began pushing strenuously for a income tax. So they could have the rich people pay as much, at least, as everybody else, if not more. And so by the time the prohibition ball kind of gets rolling and it becomes a serious conversation, progressives who may not care one way or the other about alcohol itself see banning alcohol as a way to get rid of the alcohol tax and therefore get the income tax, which of course is also going to take an amendment. So we often think about these two amendments as linked, the amendment banning alcohol and the amendment bringing it back. But it's probably more appropriate to think about the income tax amendment and the prohibition of alcohol amendment as linked, because those are directly tied to each other. And I think everybody at the time knew it. It crossed party lines. It's one of these issues where you would have wet Republicans and dry Republicans and wet Democrats and dry Democrats. And what was really fun is you would have wet wets, wet dries, and dry dries. Well, what does that mean? Well, if you personally drank alcohol, but you thought it should be made illegal, you were a wet dry. You see? If you didn't drink and you thought it should be made illegal, you were a dry. If you didn't drink but thought it should remain illegal, you were dry wet, and then I forget the last one, but you can figure it out. Now, all of these forces coalesce in the 19-teens and then have this extra dimension added to them that kicks the whole thing over the top. So let's say we got women who are trying to stand up for the rights of women and children whose husbands have fallen into alcoholism. We've got those who want a progressive taxation system, who want to get rid of the old taxation system, which is based on alcohol, so they're willing to get rid of alcohol altogether. We've got brewers who had at least been pushing this in the beginning when they thought they were going to be spared. And then, of course, remember, we do have a religious element, but then finally we have this racist element. Well, one of the primary groups associated with alcohol were the Germans, particularly with beer. Well, in the 19-teens, when we enter into World War I against the Germans, it becomes almost patriotic to oppose beer. And so many people in a patriotic fervor will join the Prohibition movement. In the same way that Fox News wanted us to stop eating French fries and all that stuff, people are saying we should stop drinking beer because beer is German and Germany's now the enemy. And that is going to be really the kicker that pushes this thing over the top. Now, Prohibition was more popular in the South and the North, and it was more popular in rural places than in urban places. Will Rogers would famously say, the South is dry and will vote dry. That is, everyone's sober enough to stagger to the polls. There's this tremendous hypocrisy among many, many people who support Prohibition, while they themselves drink quite a bit. When the 18th Amendment is passed, on the day that it goes into effect, the Prohibitionists have a big, I don't know if you can call it a party, because they're basically celebrating not being able to party. But they'll have this big event at midnight. Billy Sunday will be speaking. Billy Sunday, the great evangelical preacher of the time. And he'll say this: "The reign of tears is over. The slums will be only a memory. We will turn our prisons into factories and our jails into storehouses and corn cribs. Men will walk upright now, women will smile, and the children will laugh. Hell will forever be for rent." Now, you can look back at that and snicker, because of course it sounds ridiculous and pie in the sky. But listen to what he's saying to you there. He's telling you, he's talking about all the problems that they believe are being caused by alcohol. Slums, he says, women will smile and children will laugh. We can turn our prisons into factories. Of course, that's one of the things people say on the opposite now, ironically, to make marijuana illegal. This was a socioeconomic phenomena, much more than it was a moral phenomena. It was about how we pay our taxes. It was about who paid taxes. It was about the impact that alcoholism had on innocent people. And it was about the impact alcoholism had on our nation as a whole, really in terms of economy and productivity. And I think we completely fail to grasp that today. By the way, even during Prohibition, doctors had a medical exemption, meaning they could write a prescription. It was treated as a medicine. As Daniel Okrent said in his recent book about Prohibition, which is wonderful. He's the guy who invented fantasy sports, but he's also written a book on Prohibition. Within 2 or 3 years, you could go into virtually any city in the country and buy a prescription for $3 from your local physician, and then take it to your local pharmacy and go home with a pint of liquor every 10 days. So very much like we have medical marijuana dispensaries today, we had alcohol dispensaries back then. The rich, by the way, were still able to drink. They had stockpiled, for the most part, enormous amounts of alcohol. Because it was legal to drink it, it just wasn't legal to buy it or sell it. Warren G. Harding, the president during the beginning of this, had his own massive stockpile, and he openly drank in the White House. And it was all perfectly legal because he hadn't bought it. He had owned it before Prohibition had begun. It created a lot of problems. We think about organized crime, although I think that's bigger in our imagination than it was in real life. Perhaps a bigger problem is once you deregulate something, and this is an argument that people who support marijuana legalization make, once you deregulate it, the problem is once you make it illegal, you've deregulated it. And you can't keep it out of the hands of people you want to keep it out of. Women didn't drink in public. I'm sure women drank, but they didn't drink in public. But once you made it illegal, what's to stop them from going to a speakeasy? And that's really where the flapper comes from. In 1919, a woman's not going to go to a bar because they're not really allowed into a bar. But once you make alcohol illegal, nobody's allowed into the bar. What's to stop the woman from going in there? And of course, this gets even worse because what's to stop a 15-year-old girl from going in there? Because a 15-year-old girl going in there and getting wasted is just as illegal as a 60-year-old man going in there and getting wasted. And so what you have in these speakeasies is the first time you have women and really girls and kids going out and partying with the adults in a public way, which leads to kind of this one of the things that leads to this kind of sexual revolution that we see in the 1920s. Prohibition tended to work in rural areas, at least publicly. I'm sure people had stills at home and stuff like that. And it wasn't really largely protested. Of course, it was a bit of a disaster in the cities, and many cities just kind of ignored it, like Atlantic City. If you watch Boardwalk Empire, you see a lot of this stuff. Because Prohibition was at once unpopular, but also, at least to some extent, supported by both parties, it became a defining event politically as well. In 1924, the Democratic Party will split itself in two, trying to choose between a wet and a dry. William McAdoo will be a Southerner, very moralistic and very dry. Al Smith will be a wet. He drinks and everybody knows it. He's the governor of New York. He's also a Catholic, by the way. And the two sides can't agree on this, and so they finally agree on a bland corporate lawyer named Davis. His first name has flown out of my head, but who cares? He's one of the least interesting candidates of all time. But they had to pick him because he was somebody they could find that neither side would lose their minds over. By 1928, they have the fight out all the way, and Al Smith, of course, gets the nomination, becoming the first Catholic to be nominated by a major party for president. This is a really important event, another one of the great legacies of Prohibition, because it gives birth to the new Democratic Party. Remember that the Democratic Party had the increasingly progressive northeastern wing that FDR will come out of, and of course its old Paleolithic racist southern conservative wing. Well, Smith is part of this northeastern wing. He's the governor of New York. And this will begin, really enforce the unhinging of the racist conservative South from the new Progressive Democratic Party. And so in 1932, there's not really much of a question if it's going to be a Southern or a Northeastern progressive. And of course, that ends up being Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But it's it's Smith winning that fight in 28, and with the key issue being Prohibition that sets the stage for that. That's what causes the initial fracturing between the North and the South, and eventually gives us the new Democratic Party of FDR, which is so unbelievably important to American history. So there's another legacy of Prohibition you probably never thought about. So there you go, slutty girls and the modern Democratic Party. So where'd Prohibition go? I mean, this was a major issue, and then it disappeared. I think a lot of people think, oh, it was such a terrible idea, it was so stupid that we undid it, and then everybody realized how dumb it was, and we never wanted to go back, because how would you take liquor away? You can't legislate morality and all this stupid stuff. But that's really kind of a silly argument, because we've made all these other drugs illegal, right? So it's not like we have a problem with the idea of prohibition or legislating morality. But something very specific had to happen, I think, to kill prohibition as an issue. And here's what happened. Women's rights and the welfare state. That's what killed Prohibition. Ultimately, incidentally, when FDR pushed for the repeal of Prohibition, it was over jobs. Remember, this is the Great Depression by now. And he says, man, look at all those breweries out there. Those could be filled with workers. He's not talking about alcohol, right? He's talking about worker. Oh, if we open up all the breweries, maybe you can get a job. Maybe you can go work in a bar. Maybe you could be delivering this stuff. That's how he gets Prohibition undone, incidentally. Very clever. But the fight over Prohibition is really a fight over women's rights and what we do with the poorest people in our society. Once a woman can realistically leave her husband, and once a woman begins to have real career options, and once somebody who is poor and destitute can get help from the government and is not entirely dependent upon a man, in this case, or a father, there's really not much need for Prohibition anymore. Because we live in a world where my daughter will go to college and have a career if she wants, and while she may end up in a relationship with a man, she can always leave that relationship if she must and still have a decent life. That's why there's no more Prohibition. And that's why there's no more real talk about it. Because it wasn't a moral issue in the end of the day. It was about women and children's rights. I think it's better to think about Prohibition as one of these issues that is a part of a set of beliefs. Just like today, if you ask somebody how they feel about gay rights, you can make a series of assumptions about how they feel about all kinds of other things, from torture to war in Iraq to the tax code to business regulation. Prohibition was like that. It was in some sense kind of the abortion maybe of its day, and one of these big cut dividing issues that neatly divided the country into two sides. And it really stood in for all kinds of other things. And those things would be issues like divorce and should the government get in and help people. And I think we don't think about it that way today. Really because the Prohibition side, it didn't lose. You thought the Prohibition side lost, right? It didn't. It won. Because what it wanted was a better world for women and children. And what it got was a better world for women and children. So don't laugh too hard at those prohibitionists. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, by the way, will join with the Anti-Saloon League to create another great American phenomena, the Special Interest Group. Not my favorite legacy of Prohibition, but this was an extreme pressure group who organized lots and lots of people across the country and really had an iron grip in a ton of congressional districts around this country, where if you made them mad, you had no hope of winning election. So one of the legacies of Prohibition is the high-pressure special interest group. The NRA, in some sense, is just the modern Women's Christian Temperance Union. Different issue, but same tactic and concept. Anyway, I'm Professor Rich. I go out and have a drink. Not going to bother me. I don't really care. But please, next time you're thinking about Prohibition or talking to somebody about Prohibition, maybe you talk about it a little bit differently, because I think most people in this country really don't understand it, and if there's two things to take away from this, ask yourself, were the people who wanted Prohibition entirely wrong, and did they win or did they lose? Because I'm going to argue that they won. Anyway, I'm Professor Rich. Thanks for listening. I hope you learned something.